So, I will begin things. For anybody who came today, who may not be one of the 10 million people who has listened to your TED Talk or read the 2 of your books, can you talk about how you got interested in the field of death, dying, and palliative care?
Yeah. Besides that, it's so fun. The subject, I guess there's so much to say. The subject is compelling because I think for us in the book, and then for me professionally, I think the subject is compelling because it affects everybody. I mean, it's the one thing that we all do, is that we suffer and we die. That old phrase about death and taxes is not really relevant anymore, it seems, but death persists. So there's something unifying about this subject which I love. So old, young, black, white, skinny, fat doesn't really matter. So that's a little bit of why the subject. And I think Shoshana is the one who had this bright idea to write this book. And we had worked together on a project while she was she still is, in her function at IDEO. We were working on a project that kind of touched on rebranding how people looked at the end of life, and specifically for us, it's in hospice at the time. And that's a longer, fun story, but we got to meet over this day-long, I don't know what to call this event that IDEO put on to get us in the mood for death. We built this yurt where we all hung out and talked about how we imagined our own deaths to kind of make it personal, to bring us into the mood. And there was, so for me, coming out of healthcare, to be in this design studio was really thrilling in a lot of ways, in part because dying can be very beautiful. It can be many, many things, including beautiful. And here was an organization that had a way to see that. And so we were going through the crowd, and each one was rattling off these sort of gorgeous aspirations for their death. I mean, they were gorgeous, but they were incredibly unrealistic too. And so I was sitting there very sort of skeptical, trying to get into it. But when Shoshana finally spoke, she shared with everybody what she had been going through. I feel funny me telling this story with you sitting.
I can tell her.
Yeah, over to you, Shoshana. Yeah, I mean, I'll kick it to you now.
I think you need to move your microphone a little bit up. I'm not sure we can hear
Can you
the
guys
gorgeous words.
Sorry, it's my chest hair, yeah.
Do you want to just listen to his chest hair for the next
Wow. Sorry, guys. We'll get there.
So, I think sometimes your work chooses you. And for me, that was certainly the case. I met BJ 3 months after my father died. And he had struggled for 5 years with dementia. It was a really hard and harrowing death. And I'm sure many of you in the audience have dealt with this. I was completely lost as a caregiver. I'm someone who prides myself on being able to really get to the bottom of things as a journalist and really figure things out and kind of crack the code. And this left me feeling completely helpless and lost. Didn't know how to talk to his doctors, didn't understand how to navigate the healthcare system, didn't understand what kind of care we could expect, and just didn't know how to show up and really be there for him in the way that he needed. And so, my sister and I got to the point where when my dad died, we sat in her childhood bedroom and sat at the computer and Googled, what do you do after someone dies? Because we didn't even know how to call the funeral home. So when I met BJ, he had this very beautiful and bold vision for how to grapple with and come to terms with the end of life in a way I'd never heard before. And it really spoke to me, and I thought, wow, if I need this much help, I bet a lot of people do. And so I felt like the book kind of came to me, and then I threw it over to BJ and said, hey, I think a lot of people could use help with this. And thankfully he said yes.
BJ, do you want to tell your story of how you came to having to think about death, dying, and maybe how you became a palliative care doc?
Sure. I mean, this again, like the subject matter, it's very hard to separate the personal from the professional in this subject, and that's one of the field's really great charms, I think, but it's also one of its hazards. There's caution in that statement, but we can talk about that. But how I came to medicine at all was basically from being a patient. When I was 19, I was at college, sophomore year, and just screwing around a November evening in this commuter train that ran right up onto campus, and there were trains, not like the commuter trains here. The trains in New Jersey had the wires that run overhead. And it was just a parked train, nothing particularly special about it. But anyway, we jumped on top of the train just to climb it like you would a tree. And when I stood up, I had a metal watch on, and electricity came arced to the watch, and that was pretty much that. I mean, it was an instantaneous thing. And then I was in the hospital for months, and that's when the amputations happened surgically from there. But the bottom line here was that experience of becoming a patient, of being dependent on so many people, opened my eyes in all sorts of ways. I mean, again, it's a big conversation, but it pointed me in one of the ways my eyes were opened was sort of to our interdependence, and how we accidentally shame each other for disability, for illness, for death even, and how it felt important to do it differently. And I got to experience the charms of healthcare, the great strengths of the system, which are there. I mean, I'm alive because of medicine, and it's a technologically sort of advanced approach, and the idea that we're going to invent our way to wellness. I am alive because of that system. And at the same time, it's relatively easy to see the shortcomings of the system. So I got interested in healthcare as something that needed help, but also was very beautiful, and where, I guess most importantly for me, my experiences as a patient, as a disabled person, felt very relevant. And I just could only think of if my physician had walked in with my silhouette, that I think the experience would have been very different, not just symbolically, but the sensitivities at the bedside would have been different. So that's what attracted me to healthcare, as a way to make sense of what I was going through. And rather than, I think, the traditional idea or the old-fashioned idea around disability is it's something that you overcome, implying that you put it behind you, that you rejoin the world of the normal people at best, which is just such a importantly flawed concept. And it felt important not to overcome this, because that wasn't real. It felt important to use these experiences.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, wait.
So the Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung, who was a prolific writer in the 1950s, is perhaps as famous for his views about death as he is for his contributions to the ideas of the unconscious. But he said death is as psychologically as important as birth, and like birth, an integral part of life. He also said that we should think about death not as an end, but as a goal. Can you talk about how the two of you, how your beliefs and how your work are like this view, or maybe how it's different, of death as a goal, and death just as important to our life as birth?
Wow, I really love that. I've never heard that before. And I'll tell you that for us, the corollary in writing this book was always the birth guides. It was always, what is it? What to expect when you're expecting. That's escaped my mind for a minute. What to expect when you're expecting, which is read by 97% of pregnant women, which is an astonishing statistic. So, we have this Bible for bringing new life into the world. We prepare for it. We write birth plans. We have 10 months to think it through. And it is such a huge life cycle event. You wouldn't want to go into that unprepared. Some people do, but we don't spend any time looking at the other end of life. And so the idea was, why not create a what to expect when you're expecting to die? In fact, a friend of ours said, why don't you call the book What to Expect When You're Expiring?
I was hoping you'd get to that.
Yeah. Didn't call it that. But, you know, I think what I love about thinking of death as a goal, which I think we try to convey in the book, is that when death becomes less exotic and when you actually look at it and draw it a little closer, it becomes more familiar and you're kind of tussling with it. And we just don't do that now. We are such novices in this day and age. It used to be that, you know, we lived in more rural communities where farm animals were dying, grandma died upstairs, you probably had lost a sibling by the time you were 15. And death was a familiar home-based experience. It was something that we had direct experience with. And now we've really cordoned it off. You know, we send our elderly off to homes. We don't help people age and die in the same way. And so it's become an exotic, unfamiliar experience. So the idea of making it a goal is really beautiful, because then you are using that goal to inform how you live now. You know, if you know you're going to die and you've thought about it and you've prepared for it, you've talked about it, it really informs how you live. It changes how you show up. It changes the presence with which you live your life. It changes the decisions you make. That's certainly been my experience after dealing with death and writing this book with BJ.
Yeah, I'll add that that quote registers or resonates with me very much. I think one of the ways, I think we have it harder in the US in some ways around death. And I think it's one of the tells that we are a young country in a way. The way we handle aging, the way we handle death, the way we handle life's inevitabilities. We treat them as though they're optional, and we alienate ourselves from the truth in this way. And I think cultures that have been around longer, I think one of the themes that, and I don't pretend to be a cultural anthropologist, and there's I'm sure a lot of nuance and detail to be learned, but I think the general idea that to see death as a part of life is a very different experience than seeing death as life's antithesis, as this thing that's stealing life. If you can wrap your head around the fact that it's a package deal and they go together and it's part of it, it's how it works, well then, again, you're not alienating yourself from your own nature. So, and with that, you get to work towards something. You know, this idea of death as a goal, that sounds good to me, because it's a very different experience to work towards something than to try to run from it. So I would just, Shoshana speaks my mind in a lot of other ways. I could probably leave it at that. But I do think this is something that, I think this construct that death is part of life is a really, really important one. And I think, you know, why do you guys all show up on a cold winter night to talk about this subject? I think this idea that we're all in denial, et cetera, is probably overplayed. There's, I think, a longing, we keep seeing it, a longing to actually dig into this subject and talk about it, because it is. I don't think we have to love death. I don't think that's the goal. But maybe there's a Rumi quote, I can't make it, but something about if you love life enough, well, then you can at least include death in that love. And that feels right to me.
Yeah, I think you're right. In this country, we like things that are uncomfortable away from us. We like things packaged instead of seeing it in its raw form. When I was in Morocco, we took a cooking class and we did everything but the meat. And I said to the chef, what about the meat? Are we not going to buy the meat? What happens to the meat? And he said, you in America probably don't want to hear this, but I would never serve meat that I don't see the animal alive. And we have the exact opposite in this. If we can't buy it packaged up and cut up, we don't even like to buy it and think about it. So I think it's sort of like death.
I agree. It almost seems like this is part and parcel of our whole relationship, our weird relationship with nature, period.
Yeah.
I mean, we prefer the simulation of nature. It's kind of, I don't know what to make of that, but it seems true enough and problematic.
Not all hygienic and packaged, but go towards it. So in the book, you note 13 constructive ways of coping with the dying process. Is one of those more important? Is it a combination that's important? I encourage people to use a variety of coping strategies when they're sick so they don't wear any of them out. I don't know if this is right, because when I was reading your 13, I thought, well, I think they're all important, but maybe for different people it's one or the other. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, that's why they weren't numbered. There was no pecking order.
Right.
And we got, editing this book down. It's big as it is, but of course it used to be bigger. But we originally had that section called, I think it was like counterpoints, buffers, and something else. And I think we went a little more length to say, these are some ideas. There may be others, use them as you like, and use all of them or none of them. But to your point, I don't see a pecking order in there. Although, maybe my own bias would be that sort of one of the through lines in all of those is love. And I think, I don't know, it seems to me as if you had to name a singular force that's going to carry you through all this, both sort of caregiving and care receiving and frailty and triumph and all of it, I guess I would put my money on love. But otherwise, no, I don't see a real pecking order. And I think I personally use all of them, or I like to think I do. And the combination is nice. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. I think that works well.
So you talk about the idea of love, and I'm a health psychologist, and I think who works with couples. So I think about illness not just as affecting a sick person, but affecting the people around the sick people, affecting different systems. But you quote a reverend in the book, and the reverend said, illness is about the relationship. Is that related to what you're saying about love?
Yes, and I would say, sorry, I'm going on. Yes, the relationship to yourselves, the relationship between us, a huge deal, and I thank you for calling out the importance of caregiving in all this. To what degree we can look at illness, we usually at least give the patient a fair amount of credit. Then we have buildings erected for the care of patients. There's really nothing for the caregiver in the same way. It is it's a subtler and less, I don't know what the right word is. It's not given a lot of space or credit. For a quick minute, there are 45 million informal caregivers in this country currently. 45 million people are caring for one or more people informally, not being paid for it, trying to hold down jobs, trying to care for kids at the same time, etc. The value of that work is something along the lines of $500 billion. And so this is largely, in some ways, a very silent occupation. And but anyway, I'm straying a little bit just to kind of call out the importance of the caregiver role in all this. And any of us who've been a patient, you'll learn pretty quickly that there's not a lot of separation. The differences between me and my caregiver is pretty porous. And when it's really working well, the love is going in all directions. The care is going in all directions. It's not like a caregiver, you go this direction, care receiver, go this direction. That's as flawed as all the rest of the language around this stuff.
And what you give, you also get.
Amen.
And it affects each other.
Amen.
The giving and the getting.
Yes, they're deeply related.
So you emphasize how important it is to communicate to people you love, communicate to the people around you how you want to die. As a couples therapist, I thought about this a lot, and I thought, is this a conversation, or is it and this is probably for you more, Shoshana, is it a conversation, or is it a declaration? This is what I want when I die. So in my field, we would say it was a conversation, but then whose will do we bend to? Who gets to decide?
That's such a great question. You see it on the front lines, I would imagine, with couples. I think it is a conversation. It's an ongoing conversation. It's not a one and done. It's something that you're having over the course of your lifetime. And certainly things will change, circumstances will change as you get closer to that, because your feelings change in ways you may not be able to predict. There's a wonderful story in the book about a friend of BJ's, Rebecca Sudor, who teaches and practices at UCSF with him. And she herself is an end-of-life palliative care specialist, and it came time for her to talk to her own grandparents about this conversation. And she said to her grandfather, who was the one who was failing, "Grandpa, I would love to hear what you want at the end of life. With Grandma sitting here, can you tell us?" And he said, "You know, I've had a wonderful life with your grandmother, wonderful marriage. I realize I'm getting older, I have heart failure. No heroics, please. No chest compressions, just let me go when the time comes." And she then turned to Grandma and said, "Grandma, did you hear what Grandpa just said?" And Grandma said, "Yes." And she said, "Will you acknowledge those wishes when the time comes?" She said, "I don't think so, no." And Rebecca was confused. She said, "What do you mean?" And Grandma said, "Well, I want to spend every single second as long as I possibly can with him. So whatever those doctors have to do to keep him alive, I want them to do it."
And who decided?
What's that?
Who decided in the end?
Well, so Rebecca then turned back to Grandpa, and she said, "Did you hear what Grandma just said?" And he said, "Yes, I did." She said, "What do you think about that?" And he said, "Whatever she wants." And that's just a perfect example of how we do not exist in a vacuum. We exist in relationship. We exist in love and in interdependence. So making a declaration is all well and good, but you're living with someone who is going to be hugely affected by your decision, who is invested in your decision.
I call it the biggest stakeholder in your health other than you.
Exactly. And sometimes, when you do fill out an advanced healthcare directive, you have to choose that person who's going to speak for you, should you not be able to speak for yourself. And the surprising thing is, oftentimes, your spouse may not be the person to honor those wishes because they're so in love with you, it's hard for them to let you go. Or even if they're not in love with you, it may be hard for them to let you go. So I actually had this conversation with my husband recently where I said, "Honey, I might actually have my sister be my healthcare agent." And he was not very happy about that, and it was definitely something we had to talk through. But I actually think my sister might be able to honor my wishes better.
Wow. So you said, I don't know if it was in the book or something else I saw with you, I think it was a talk you gave, Shoshana, when you talked about living like a tree and using the giving tree as an example, but talked about giving in different ways as we live and as we get closer to dying. But it made me think about, and you talked about this in terms of being dependent, shouldn't we also learn how to receive? I think in this country we don't learn how to receive. We're very good at giving. And so I was thinking, maybe we need a different example than a tree that gives its entire life. A plant, maybe, that has to give and receive. But
yeah, it's so funny you bring up the giving tree, because I just read an op-ed by someone we know, Adam Grant, who said, the Giving Tree is a terrible book for children, because the tree gives everything, selflessly gives and gives and gives until it's just a stump, and then it gives the little boy, who's now an old man, a stump to sit on, and it is the worst example of giving, because you also need to be someone who is able to receive and is able to be in a relationship. It was a funny op-ed, like anything that rails against the Giving Tree is
But I don't think
daring.
we learn how to receive,
Exactly.
and we think about receiving, and you just use the word as being dependent, like a child maybe, or...
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, go for it.
No, this one really gets me. Okay, so this idea of independence that you mentioned, Shosh, autonomy, independence, these are, they're not possible. They're approximations or goals or aspirations, or the far side of the spectrum. But again, I think so much of this work is refining owning our language around this, and losing my independence. So when I became disabled, I was afraid to lose my independence. Of course, not appreciating that before the accident, I wasn't independent either. I mean, no.
You were a dumb college kid.
Yeah, I was a dumb college kid, but I was just a living creature of any kind. I don't believe an autonomous or independent person has ever existed. How lonely would that be anyway? I think we're all on some spectrum between total dependence and total independence all the time. And it felt really like a really important lesson to call this out as a myth. And I think it's particularly pertinent in this country, maybe particularly pertinent right now. But this idea, because otherwise, as someone who's become disabled, you feel like all the cues are like you're moving from the independent world, this glistening, wonderful, beautiful thing, to the dependent world, that's served with crappy food and fluorescent light and over like some other place.
And then we owe somebody something because they're taking care of us.
Yes, and it becomes like where the objects of pity at best, and charity, not reciprocity. And you have to almost demand, it's changed, I think, a little bit since the disability rights movement. I think we've come a long way. I think we've got a long way to go. And this is a flawed concept of pity. That someone would look at someone ostensibly less fortunate, and pity is a proxy for some amount of compassion on some level. If you're not careful as a sick person or as a disabled person, you might receive that pity because it feels almost like saccharine. It can feel kind of good. It feels like attention. But if you start to think about it, it's deeply flawed. It's disempowering. And I think most problematic about it, and I think what a lot of us who've been chronically ill or disabled for a while, you come to realize, part of the problem is someone looking at you with pity, you know in your bones that the joke's on them. That they think they have all their stuff so together? They think they're so independent and have everything just so? Oh, no. No, they do not. Compared to whom, for one, and for how much longer anyway they do. So, anyway, I can't remember where I was going exactly, but pity's, thanks, Jules. By the way, I just have to call it, I grew up around here, and so I have a lot of friends in the audience, so it's very nice to see you guys. I just have to say that, because in case I have this weird shit-eating grin, excuse my language, on my face, talking about death, that's a big reason why. So, yeah, pity, very flawed. It just reveals that we're not in touch with ourselves, our own flaws, our own brokenness, our own wounds. And
pity is a way we remove ourselves too. This isn't me.
Totally. Yes.
This is just something that happened to you.
Exactly. And that's just further isolating for everybody involved. And it makes the fall that's coming for that person even higher.
Yeah. Yeah. I like the advice in the book, I think it's yours, Shoshana, for caregiving. Don't just do something, sit there. Turning that old phrase, don't just sit there, do something on its head. But I love that. But isn't it easier said than done when we all want to help and we think of helping as so active? We think of doing as so active. And
Yes.
I don't know how easy it is when we're watching someone that we love, when we're watching them decline, to be able just to sit there. What do you think about that?
And it's so related to the question you just brought up about receiving, because it is so hard to just sit with someone who really can't do much more than that. And that was certainly my experience with my father, where our doctor said, what he really needs is quiet now, no drama. He needs to be at home and quiet. And I am not a very quiet person, nor am I a very slow person, and I have kids, and I have work, and like all of us, I'm running from thing to thing. So the ability to synchronize to his time and to slow down and just sit there on the couch with him and hold his hand was really challenging. And
Was it a gift that you gave him as well as he gave you to be able to do that?
I feel like, look, as a parent, you give that gift to your children for so long. Like, how many times did he sit there waiting for me to learn something, to learn how to go to the bathroom? I mean, how many times did he sit there waiting for me to learn how to eat, learn how to cross the street? Like, you go through that experience of being brought up, and your parent does all of those things for you. And that requires the patience of a saint. And then the role reversal happens, where my father basically had regressed to an infantile state, and I was now his parent in a way. And it was my time to sit there and just be with him. And I think it was a great lesson for me, and it's not easy, because I think we like to fix. We're fixing culture. We're people who like beginnings, not endings, and we like things to be fixed. And sometimes people can't be fixed. And that's a hard lesson, but it's a really powerful one.
Mm-hmm. So I asked you before, BJ, and we couldn't remember where you had said this, and I think you were an art history major in college, nothing to do with being a doctor, I don't think, maybe it is. But something in your book, or something that you've spoken of before, and talking about death and dying, you talked about turning anguish into a flower. And I said to you, it was so evocative. Can you explain the metaphor of that?
Yeah. We've been coming up on this point, that, part of it is this sort of giving and receiving, and I think part of it, as you mentioned this too, is that receiving all that love, needing that love, not in some recreational way or some convenient way, but really actually needing it, like when you're in great anguish. I think that is when healing begins, and that's when transformation happens, and that's where a pride of going through something happens, and that's where we see health, we see illness as experiences, as something that unfurls over time. Then these things flower, they unfurl, they change, they morph, and part of the fun is the dance of, I think early on, myself and others, I've seen a lot of patients cling to their life or their identity, really, with fingernails, and in some ways we reward each other for that. In fact, I see, you ever have a friend growing up like I do who are like really funny, and then they get to a period where they're maybe not so funny, but we like pressure them to be funny all the time, and they have to stay in that role. I've been at bedsides a lot of the time where, like a father, a patriarch of a family may be coming to the end, and he finally dares to cry. And I'll watch the kids sort of shush him, because they don't want to see, that's not the image they have of their dad. That scares them. Doesn't comport with that identity that they've come to rely upon. And of course that is what it is, I don't mean to judge, but part of me watches that and feels so sad. Like, let this man change. There's something really beautiful about daring to be affected by your life and be affected by each other. It's so, to me, very meaningful.
We're back to love.
Back to love, don't I tell you, that's the one.
It all comes back to love. At the Family Institute, we like that.
Yeah, and I just simply, I guess I'll just close on this question by saying, like, if you like compassion, if you like flowers, if you like anything in sort of some beautiful end point, let's just stick with compassion. Like everyone, I think, loves the idea of compassion. Receiving it is nice, it's a good, warm feeling. But just remembering the reliance, to have the compassion, you have to have the suffering. That's the entry fee. And similarly to this sort of idea of flowering, you have to have this sort of anguish and growth and pain and transformation to get to that flower. You don't just plop on this earth as a flower and stay there. It doesn't work that way.
Mm-hmm. So in the book, you talk about the idea of physician-assisted death and the laws around it. And you don't really come out and say it, but it sounds to me like you're a proponent for the people that are seeking it. And this is a hard question, and I was just speaking to a sorority sister of mine before this about this topic. But I've heard you talk very poignantly about your sister dying by suicide. And how do we know when people are looking for death and looking for help? Is it an affirmative choice? Is it a giving up? Should we be the ones to say, no, you can't do this? In my field, we say, prevent suicide at all costs. And is mental health not a reason to want to die? or failing mental health as opposed to failing physical health, and you've been very close to this issue. What do you say about that?
Well, it's a big subject, and so I don't have a sort of singular position per se. I do think that there are problems with our sort of construct in healthcare that we pathologize, things that are very normal, to kind of go to war with them, to combat them. And on some level that serves us. I mean, I think depression, anxiety, I think these can be actual diagnoses with treatments that actually help, and there's a mechanism and a pathway that's useful. But I think it's also useful to see that as one construct of many. And sometimes I think we confuse our constructs, these things that help us digest reality, with the reality in themselves. And I think we get in trouble. Health medicine does that a lot. It's very reductive. So I certainly think there's something to psychiatry and the idea of a diagnosis and treatment, etc. But I don't believe that anyone who wishes to die is necessarily mentally ill. I don't believe that. I don't think it's a one-to-one correlation. And it takes a lot of work with someone to ferret that out. So you mentioned the aid in dying laws. Now, I don't know where Illinois stands on it, but there are, I think, 10 states now that have aid in dying laws on the books. And the old language for this is physician-assisted suicide, but because the stigma around suicide, we removed the word from the mix. And so physician aid in dying is simply this idea that as someone with a terminal diagnosis, that's the entry fee there, if you have a terminal diagnosis, and if you meet certain qualifications of being compos mentis, and usually a 2-week waiting period, of repeating the desired stated wish, and free of coercion, et cetera, then you will qualify to be given a lethal dose of medication that the law requires you take by yourself. As a physician, I can't inject you with a lethal dose of medication. That's nowhere legal in this country except in some states' prison systems. So this idea that I can give you this drug, and the purpose of this drug is to end your life, but you have to take it. The way the sort of medical ethics around this is a sort of a double effect is the language, and this is a very old construct, which is basically saying my intention as a physician, if my intention is to quell your suffering, and it has this side effect of ending your life or hastening your death, that side effect is okay as long as this is a method of last resort, and my intention is to end your suffering. So these are these sort of frameworks we have to navigate to get there. I am neutral to positive on the law. I am glad to have that capacity in my practice because...
In your state.
In my state, right. Not because I want to have that power, it's just that I've had patients who want me to have that power. It's very frustrating to not be able to help folks in this way. I'll stop in a second. I just want to say another thing that's very interesting about the states which have these laws. There's a lot of concern for a slippery slope. That, if we make it too easy to get off the planet, then as soon as something hard befalls us, we'll just get off the planet. More than us wanting to get off the planet, our families and physicians are sort of implied, it looks like a really hard problem, you should probably die. So obviously that's really true. We don't want to go down that road, and I don't see that actually really happening. One thing that's really interesting from these states, though, is that a lot of the people, a big chunk of folks who actually go through that process and get the medication, never end up using it. That the therapy is just knowing you have that parachute. And I have old pain pills in my medicine chest that 10 years ago expired. I just like knowing they're there if I need them. And that's the bomb.
Mm-hmm. Can I just add one other personal story, because I just heard this. A friend of ours, Keith Yamashita, his father was dealing with a lot of health challenges, and he's diabetic, and he's doing dialysis, and he just kept saying to Keith and to his wife, I just want to die. I'm done. I just want to die. And it took a lot of conversation and a lot of, as you say, Vijay, teasing it out for Keith to figure out that he didn't really want to die. What he wanted was for his wife and his son to understand how hard it was for him to live right now. Because his wife kept kind of running around and, getting him this and,
Not just sitting there.
Not just sitting there, making sure the house was clean and getting the groceries and setting things up and getting him through dialysis. And what he really needed was for her to hear how hard it was for him to live. And he just wanted to express that. And So Keith sat by his bedside and said, Dad, tell me, what's going on? Why do you want to die? And his father just unleashed, it was like a dam broke, and said, it's so hard. It's so hard to get it. It's so much work to stay alive right now. And once he had really expressed that and saw that Keith and his wife really heard it, and that he was being acknowledged, it just, his mood changed. Suddenly he stopped saying, I want to die, I want to die. He started getting, his mood changed, he started getting better about his medication, stuff like that. So
what he meant was, I want you to understand.
What he meant was, listen to me.
Yeah.
Just listen to me. And so, it is really hard to tease out sometimes what people are trying to say.
I want to go back to that quote about that illness and death and dying is about relationships. Because it's not just the relationships with the people we live with and the people we share our life with, but you talk a lot about the relationship with your healthcare team. And not just declarations, but conversations. I love the question in the book of, what is this treatment meant to do? Is this treatment meant to cure me? Is it meant to extend my life? Is it meant to increase my comfort? And how do you, as a doctor, how do you help people figure out what they want versus what, as healthcare providers, we're told to do?
Well, this is where the field of palliative care is so poignant and potent at this time. I mean, I think, so you guys probably know this, but palliative care, this specialty, is simply the treatment of suffering, in contrast to the treatment of disease. And suffering is a universal experience. We all do it. And at the same time, as universal as it is, it's very subjective. So what causes suffering in you would be different from me, etc. And so it's a very dynamic issue, a very dynamic process. But it has this effect of, in the healthcare setting, of leveling the playing field. Because if the subject is your disease, well, I, as an expert, I know more about your disease than you do. If the subject is suffering, then the patient knows more than I do about their experience, about how they feel, about who they are, about how they see themselves in the world, about how they see themselves might conflict with the world, etc. So it has this nice effect of leveling the playing field in healthcare and putting the basic act of a healthcare provider, it becomes very clearly the main muscle is listening, versus the rest of healthcare, mostly is sort of telling or doing. And as a patient, you feel that your job is to sort of lay still. So in some ways, you could say, before we got seduced into thinking that we could cure our way through everything, I think all healthcare would have been considered palliative most of the time. But we are in a moment when the healthcare system and technology is advanced, where we can prop a body up almost indefinitely. Where you need a specialty to come along and kind of reorient healthcare back to something more fundamental, just more fundamental, like life and death, and they're related, and as people suffer, etc. So that's a time where healthcare needs this corrective. Now I forgot again what the question I was answering.
The question was, when you're teaching people to say, what does this treatment do?
Yeah, to get there. So I'm sorry, that long preamble, just to contextualize this work. The way into that, very often, for one, it takes time. This is another problem with healthcare, this transactional 15-minute encounter. What can you achieve in that? And it's just as miserable, if not more, for the provider as it is for the patient. It becomes impossible to practice your craft in that way, because what this really requires is time together. And it may be 3 visits in, if we have the time, before I ever ask you anything about your illness. It may start, all the conversation may be, tell me about your family life, or how do you spend your time, free time, what do you do? When you feel good for a second, like for a moment, even for a moment, tell me what's going on when you feel good.
That does not happen.
No, of course it doesn't. There's no time, and we're not trained otherwise to do that. But that's what begets the relationship. And then once we're in a relationship, then you might trust me a little bit more because I'm listening to you. I care what you say. I don't have an agenda. And then when it comes time to ask very heavy questions, with great consequence, well then the trust is there to do so. But a lot of the way into foreplay is much more gentle and oftentimes completely demedicalized.
And so different than what we're used to, being illness-focused and not patient-focused. So this is a personal question, and because I loved reading your book, and I think that everybody should read it. But I think it's especially important for people who are in maybe the last stages of their disease or their life. And as I was reading this, I had a hard time thinking about how do you suggest to a friend or relative, could you read this book about death and dying? Could you read this book about the end? And is there a way to say that with optimism and hope and compassion? How do we tell somebody, read this?
Yeah, we've struggled with this one because one, it's kind of an intimidating title, we recognize. Although I have to say, the original title was How to Die, Field Guide. So we backed off of that.
You softened it.
We softened it. Yeah, I mean, I think we always imagined that the people who would actually pick this book up would be the kind of halo of support and care around the person who was dying. We're always incredibly gratified when someone who is dying, we just heard from someone here tonight who's dying, comes to the book. I think that takes enormous bravery. So we always imagined in some ways that it would be more of a caregiver. However, we wrote the book directly to the person who is dying or to the patient because it is your experience. Neither BJ nor I can get inside that body and that mind and experience. And we're beginners too, right? Neither of us have died yet as far as I know. So we want the book to feel like a friend is giving you some help. It's holding your hand through it. And so in that way, if you give the book to someone and say, I read this because I'm kind of thinking about these issues myself, and I'm trying to plan a little bit and have some conversations with my family, maybe you'll find something useful in this. Just a suggestion. And they can take it and throw it across the room if they want to. And we even suggest that in the introduction, I think.
I think the trick of, so this happens, folks of a certain generation in particular, if you ask them to pressure them to do their advanced directive and state their wishes and all that, then you can tell they're not going to do it. The way they see, that's just not what they're going to do. But very often, if you say to that same person, well, this is one of the kindest things you can do for your family. Well, that often changes the dialogue because then they're willing to. If you can see it as a selfless act, that appeals to a lot of folks. So sometimes, if it's a kid or a friend, it can be very helpful to say, if you want to give this book to someone, you can say, please, I know the title might be scary, but you'll see this book really is about living until you die, and look at the table of contents. You can dip in and out of it and use it for what it's worth and leave the rest. But in one way, I get to the point where you say, essentially, you're doing me a favor by looking at it. Or as a caregiver, having it on your nightstand or in your house, and people just becoming familiar with seeing this kind of language around, which is why we talk about this as much as we can, so that the words death and end aren't so terrifying, and so we don't have these built-in defenses. So that's as close as an answer as we've come up with. It's still, these days, still a pretty daring thing to do is to give this book to someone. That's, again, I think that has to do with some of the shortcomings in the society in which we live.
To caregivers, it would be easy because you're showing compassion for their situation.
Yeah, and I'll say that we've come a long way, I'd say even in the last 5 to 10 years with books like Being Mortal and Where Breath Becomes Air. The conversation has opened up.
Tuesdays with
Maury. And even The Gentle Art of Swedish Death Cleaning, which I might add is a bestseller. There's actually a word for death cleaning in Swedish, dostadning. Well, you go through your house and just decide, I can live without that, I can live without that, I'm going to clean up my whole act.
You have a whole chapter about that.
Yeah, so my kids don't have to inherit all of this, and they don't have to deal with it. There's a very kind of pragmatic element to our book too, where it's like, I'm gonna clean up my attic, and I'm gonna clean up my emotional affairs, and I'm gonna lean into this in a different way.
Well, I've gotten the privilege of getting to ask the questions, but I think now it might be time to open it up and ask the audience what questions they have.